Hello students, I'm Gauri, Department of Economics from Villamari Junior College for Girls, an institution which stands for Quality Education for Girl Child. Today, I'm going to explain Keynesian Theory of Income and Employment from the chapter Theories of Employment in Public Finance. This topic is for 10 marks from the very important topic from the examination point of view. Let us talk about this theory. James Keynes has explained this theory with the help of three important concepts, that is aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and effective demand. What exactly is aggregate demand? What is aggregate supply? And what is effective demand? We have it in the coming slide. We have a slide that explains aggregate demand. We have a slide which talks about the table and the graph for the aggregate demand. The same thing with aggregate supply and effective demand. Let us see what is aggregate demand. When I use this term, it means that the total demand for all commodities in an economy at a particular level of employment. And here, as the level of employment increases, the aggregate demand also increases as incomes are generated more. The next one is aggregate demand price. This is the expenditure that is expected. That is expected expenditure is known as aggregate demand price. We have a statement that shows aggregate demand price at various levels of employment, which is considered to be the aggregate demand function. This is also explained with the help of a table and a graph. Here we have a table that shows the level of employment, which is measured in lakhs of workers, and aggregate demand price, which is taken in crores. When the level of employment is 10 lakhs, the aggregate demand price, that is expected expenditure, is 600 crores. And if it is less than that, they have to increase the production. And as the level of employment is increasing, the aggregate demand price is also increasing. The same thing is shown with the graph, where you have on employment is shown on x-axis, aggregate demand price is shown on y-axis. The curve is going upwards. That indicates that as the level of employment is increasing, the aggregate demand price is also increasing. The next one is aggregate supply, which considers the total supply of all commodities produced by all entrepreneurs at a particular level of employment. Here we consider that all the entrepreneurs will be supplying different volume of goods at various levels of employment. That is considered as aggregate supply. Aggregate supply price, once they are selling the commodities, once they are supplying the commodities, they receive some amount which is considered as aggregate supply price. So we say the amount that the entrepreneurs must obtain as the price for the output that they are supplying in an economy. We have a table that shows the aggregate supply price at various levels of employment is called as aggregate supply function. This is again shown with the help of a graph, and the graph is the levels of employment, which is measured again in lakhs of workers, and aggregate supply price, which is measured in crores. As the level of employment is 10 lakhs, the total supply of the commodities, that is the amount that they have received, is 500 crores. And as the employment is increasing, the supply is also increasing. And we are assuming that 16 lakhs of workers is the employment and 800 crores is the supply, what they have supplied in an economy. Here we have a graph. On x-axis we show employment, on y-axis we show aggregate supply price. This is starting from the origin. It shows that, it indicates that when there is no employment, there is no supply of the commodity. And ON is the level of employment where the aggregate supply is horizontal, vertical parallel to OY axis. It shows that there is no further increase in supply of the commodity. The next one we have is effective demand. Effective demand is a point where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. Over here, we have, this is explained with the help of a table and a graph. Now, employment is measured in lakhs. Aggregate supply and aggregate demand is measured in crores. As I said that, effective demand is a point where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. At some level of employment, you find the aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. So from the table, we can notice that at 14 lakhs of employment, the aggregate supply is 700 and aggregate demand is also 700. So that is supposed to be the equilibrium point according to King. The same thing is explained with the help of a graph where we take employment on x-axis, aggregate demand price and aggregate supply price is taken on y-axis. E1 is the point where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply with ON one level of employment. But E1 is not supposed to be the equilibrium point. It is under employment situation because they consider full employment is to be the equilibrium. Thereby, there is increase in the aggregate demand. So you find a shift in demand curve from AD1 to AD2 where government expenditure is also involved because there is no possibility for the private sectors to invest. The government spends money for the welfare of the economy. So as the shift in AD1 to AD2, you have a new equilibrium point that is E2 where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. E2 is a new equilibrium point and this is considered as C plus I plus D. Further increase in the demand, you have a shift in the demand curve to AD3, which is a new demand curve. But here, the supply remains constant at 16 lakhs of employment with 800 as ASP. There is no further increase in the supply of the output or supply of goods and services. Thereby, any increase in the demand beyond E2 point, we say that it is inflation. There's a possibility of price increases because supply is not matching to its demand. So beyond E2 point, so the gap created between E2 and E3, we consider it to be inflationary gap because the full employment is achieved, supply remains constant. So further increase in demand leads to inflation or increase in the prices. Let us talk about the graph over here. ADP's aggregate demand price and aggregate supply price intersect each other at point E1, which is the equilibrium point. And at this particular point, we have ON is the level of employment. But here, ON, as I said, it is a situation of underemployment. We still have some of the resources which are still idle. Therefore, to achieve the full employment, we have to have a shift in the aggregate demand curve. And only this is possible. The shift in aggregate demand curve, when it is possible, only when the government spends money on goods and services which is not invested by the private entrepreneurs. So thereby, you have a shift in the demand curve, that is a new demand curve. At E2 is a new effective demand or equilibrium point, and economy reaches equilibrium at ON2. Beyond E2, if the demand is increasing, there is no increase in supply, so that leads to inflation. Thereby, the gap between E2 and E3 is considered as an inflationary gap. Let us see certain major aspects of this particular theory of income and employment. Here, in the short run, the total income of an economy depends upon the volume of employment. Generally, that is a very concept. As the employment is increasing, the incomes of the people also increases. Thereby, we say that income of the country or economy depends upon the employment. The second point talks about aggregate supply depends upon the physical and technical conditions of production, that they do not change in the short run. In short run, the aggregate supply cannot be changed. The aggregate supply depends upon the physical, that is output of goods and services, and this depends upon the technical conditions or development of technology. Anytime, whenever the technology develops, the physical quantity of goods and services also increases. And this is not possible in the short run, it is only happening in the long run. And changes in aggregate demand will bring changes in income and employment. Let us talk about the next point. Effective demand consists of consumption demand and investment demand. What is consumption demand? It totally depends upon the propensity to consume, which is stable in the short run. In the short run, when the incomes are not increasing, incomes cannot change, so the propensity to consume remains the same in the short run. And investment demand depends upon the marginal efficiency of the capital. Efficiency of the capital increases the production of goods and services, and this investment always depends upon the rate of interest. So here, before I conclude this topic, we have to talk about aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and effective demand to explain this theory. The next topic for this chapter we have is public finance is nothing but incomes and expenditures of the government. So when I talk about the government, it means the central government, the state government, and the local bodies. But what is the need? The government needs revenue. The way we require money to perform our duties, the same manner the government also needs the money which is considered as a government revenue. They need money to perform certain duties. So thereby, the incomes and expenditures of the government, we say it is a public finance. Let us see one of the definition given by the economist. According to Hugh Dalton, it is concerned with the income and expenditure of public authorities and with the adjustment of one to another. This is a definition which is given in quotes. We need to write it is in the same manner. It is concerned with the income and expenditure of public authorities and with the adjustment of one to another. Talks about the income and expenditure. Let us see the revenue received by the government from the various sources. The government gets money from different sources, which is considered as the public revenue. And to name them, the government receives money or the government receives revenue from two major sources. One is tax revenue and the other one is non-tax revenue. The revenue received by the government from different sources, we consider under two major heads, tax revenue and non-tax revenue. Let us see what comes under tax revenue. There are direct taxes and indirect taxes. First, let us talk about direct taxes. And even under direct taxes, the taxes that are imposed on individuals and companies. Now, what are those taxes that are imposed on individuals and companies? They are income tax, corporate tax, interest tax, and expenditure tax. There is one more tax, direct tax, which is imposed on property and capital. That is assets of individuals and companies. And these taxes are wealth tax, estate duty, etc. So tax revenue, direct taxes and indirect, even under direct taxes, taxes imposed on individuals and companies, taxes imposed on property. The next one, we have indirect taxes. The taxes that levied on goods and services. Indirect taxes are nothing but the taxes which are levied on goods and services. That is excise duty, customs duty and service tax. And recently the government has introduced GST, that is goods and service tax, which is supposed to be the indirect tax, which has replaced many indirect taxes in India. So what is GST? Goods and service tax, which is supposed to be indirect tax, which has replaced many indirect taxes in India. Now, when did this act has come? GST Act was passed in the Parliament on 29th March 2017, which has came into effect on 1st July 2017. You have to remember the date. Came into effect on 1st July 2017. But what exactly is a GST? We consider this to be a comprehensive, a multi-stage, destination-based tax which is levied on every value addition. Comprehensive, multi-stage, destination-based act levied on every value addition. This is an indirect tax which is levied on supply of goods and services, but here they are fixed on 4 different slabs. You have a slab of 5%, a slab of 12%, 18%, and 28%. So GST is fixed on 4 different slabs, 5, 12, 18, and 28. What are the 3 different types of GST? We have CGST, that is supposed to be Central Goods and Service Tax, SGST, State Goods and Service Tax, and IGST, Interstate Goods and Service Tax. Let us talk about CGST, which is collected by the central government on an intra-state sale. SGST, that is collected by the state government on intra-state sale. IGST, collected by the central government for interstate sale. And let us see what are the various taxes that have what in GST before the pre-GST. These are some of the taxes. I'm naming few of the taxes which have been renamed as, which is included under GST. They were indirect taxes in the pre-GST region. We have central excise duty, duties of excise, additional duties of excise, additional duties of customs, special additional duty of customs, state VAT, and central sales tax, etc. So these are indirect taxes in the pre-GST region, and these are some of the taxes will not come under the preview of GST. They are petroleum, crude, high-speed diesel, petrol, natural gas, aviation, turbine fuel, alcoholic liquor, that is for human consumption. GST is not included, does not cover for these particular products. Let us talk about the other side, that is non-tax revenue. Tax revenue, we have seen direct taxes and indirect taxes. Let us see with non-tax revenue. Under non-tax revenue, we have administrative revenue, commercial revenue, loans and advances, and grants in aid. These are non-tax revenue. Let us see each one of them. The first one is administrative revenue. The government receives certain administrative services. There are so many services the government provides to us, and we pay in the form of license fee, tuition fees, penalties, fines. All this comes under the administrative revenue. The next one is commercial revenue. The government also owns certain enterprises, which is called as public sector enterprises. The revenue that the government receives from these enterprises or the profits that they receive from these enterprises are considered as a commercial revenue. And some of the companies, public sector enterprises, we have Indian Oil Corporation, IOC, Bharat Sanchar Nigam Limited, BSNL, Bharat Heavy Electricals Limited, BHEL, Indian Railways, State Road Transport Corporations. All these are the commercial revenue. The revenue received from these companies, public sector, I just have named few of them. So the revenue what the government receives from these enterprises is commercial revenue. The next one we have is loans and advances. When does we get this situation? When the government expenditure exceeds than the income, then they have to obtain the loan from financial institutions if it is within the country or outside the country. So the government have to depend on loans and from financial institutions within the country or foreign governments or any international financial institution if the expenditures are exceeding the revenue. The next one is grants in aid. Now this is something what the amount what the government receives but without any condition of repayment. We need not pay for this. And over here, the state government receives grants from central government and the central government receives from the foreign governments or any international funding agency. This generally we find any state suffering from any natural calamity. Recently, when we had the Kerala floods, the government has spent, it was from voluntary contribution made from institutions, made from NGOs, and made from the government. So this kind of funds, when the government is giving it or receiving it, then we call it is grant in aid. So these are the different kinds of revenue what the government gets it from direct taxes, tax revenue and non-tax revenue, tax revenue, direct taxes and indirect taxes. Non-tax revenues are commercial revenue, administrative revenue, loans and advances and grants in aid. In case if you have to go in detail, so please write for 10 marks an assignment. Just take an assignment, just set your time and just see how much time, within how much time. Time management plays a very important role. Set your time and see within how much time you can write one 10-mark answer which is covered in today's class. That is theory of income and employment, which is given by Keynesian theory. And the next 5 marks question or a 2 marks question. This can come for 2 marks. This can also come for 5 marks. And 5 marks you have to explain in detail. And for 2 marks, you have to just write a flow chart. That is, the government receives the revenue from these are the sources. Draw a flow chart and show how does the government get the revenue. Just give a sub points for the direct taxes, sub points for indirect taxes, and just write what comes under the non-tax revenue. That is administrative, commercial, loans and advances, grants and gifts. And for 10 marks, you have to write the introduction. That is J.M. Keynes. What are the concepts that he has used? He has used 3 concepts. That is aggregate demand, supply and effective demand. Write each one of them in detail and draw a table and graph. While drawing the graph, be very careful. You have to represent what is taken on x-axis, what is taken on y-axis, and how the curve is going upwards or sloping downwards. And you also have to specify the reason. When I was talking about aggregate demand, I said that the demand is increasing when the level of employment is increasing. So thereby I have shown an upward curve. Likewise in supply also, it starts from the origin, from the zero, saying that when there is no employment, the supply remains zero. So we are starting from zero and it remains, we have a vertical line parallel to OY axis that indicates that it is full employment situation. There is no further increase in supply. And we have shown an combined graph, which is effective demand, which shows that how the equilibrium point at E1 and E2. E1 is not considered as a full employment. E2 is considered as a full employment on equilibrium. So we have two topics covered for today's class. One is 10 marks and one is 5 marks. Thank you girls. Thank you students.